Hello and welcome, I'm Clara the Scrivener, and today I'm here to talk about the Booker long list Town Called Solace. This is a book by Mary Lawson that I picked up recently because I went down a Booker Prize rabbit hole where I was looking up, and this is the Canadian pick, and I was like, this is awesome, I'm going to read this. And once I read it, I was surprised to look up reviews and find out that I didn't find a single one that was like fully positive. Some of them had positive elements or thought that it was an okay book, just not one that was worthy of a prize, but I really enjoyed it. And I think for very personal reasons, but I would like to share in a short one, spoiler free, what my thoughts are. So, first of all, this is a quiet, character focused story that nothing dramatic happens. Like, there are elements that happen that are dramatic, but all of them are subdued to the point that they may as well not be dramatic. And I really enjoyed this, and I think that this is an element why it might not be well received, but I think that it is really important. Because my understanding of Booker things, and I won't talk about that exclusively, is that you want to do something new. And sometimes I think doing something new means doing something that is anticlimactic, that is an important story about humanity that doesn't need to be big or dramatic or intense to show its themes, to show its importance. And this is a story also in which the characters never fully acknowledge their heart, nor do they fully acknowledge their faults. And it really feels like an everyday piece of work that does not focus on a big plot line, but really following these characters in an intimate way. And sometimes they're annoying and sometimes they're frustrating, but I think that's an important aspect of the book because it feels very real to real life. So we follow three different perspectives. The first and oldest is 75-year-old Elizabeth Orchard. She is a woman who has recently gone to the hospital. And we also follow Liam Kane, and he is a man who has moved into her house afterwards. And then we have the central and most important character, I would say, who is 7-year-old Clara, and her sister Rose disappeared around the same time as Mrs. Orchard. Her neighbor moved away and, well, moved to the hospital. About 2 weeks after both Rose and Mrs. Orchard has disappeared, Clara is sitting in her living room because she has taken up vigil watching for her sister. Her sister has disappeared a few times. She's 16 years old and she's run away. She is rebellious. She has big beehive hair. This is set in the 1970s, 1972 in Northern Ontario. And her sister has disappeared and she has not come back. So the police have gone out to look and they've kind of given up, and that her mother is in full-blown depression, barely leaving her room, and her father is trying to be optimistic when also obviously cracking around the seams of his perfection. And she notices that the neighbor is moving in, that is not Mrs. Orchard, that he's moving boxes, and she is, in her 7-year-old, very upset about this. She thinks that he's stealing, she thinks that he's moving in on an area that is clearly Mrs. Orchard property, and that she has the key to go and look at Moses. And I think this is often maybe where the annoyance is coming from. It can be challenging to look at a 7-year-old, and I think that she is depicted very well for being 7, but it's also quite frustrating sometimes to be like, can you not tell what is here? And I think that it's obvious at this point, even in the first chapters, that Mrs. Orchard is dead. I don't think that's really a spoiler because the second chapter is from Liam's point of view, and we really get the sense that he is taking over and that he is packing up all of Mrs. Orchard's things, who was his babysitter when he was a child. And then we see Mrs. Orchard in the hospital, in which she talks about her experience there and being an elderly woman. And I think from that point of view, it's very lovely to have an author who is also in her 70s being told the story about what it feels like to no longer be valued. She has this relationship with a woman who is next bed to her, who is less sophisticated than her, and that isn't being even respected as much as Mrs. Orchard is, and she isn't even being respected very much at all. I enjoyed these elements in the hospital, and I also enjoyed the elements of seeing her as a woman in her 30s and 40s who was next door neighbors to Liam in Guelph, which is about 20 minutes from where I live, so I absolutely love that aspect. And this is where kind of the personal comes in. I really enjoyed seeing a story that took place in Ontario. Canada is a country that is obviously represented and a bigger country than many on the world stage, and yet I often feel like I've never really seen my place represented without looking it up actively. I read my first book with Canadian story when I was 14 in class. It was a horror story. It terrified me. And until last year, I had not read another one where they might be a Canadian author, but they were never taking place in the countries and places I knew. And to see that familiarity is something that, well, if you're American or you're British, you probably can't understand because the world is littered with that. But just to have the simply dropped towns that I visited and to not have to look at a map or imagine wrongly what a world looks like is something so personal. To have the places dropped as familiar places I've been to North Bay, to Sudbury, to Thunder Bay, all of these places that were lovely to see, Toronto, and to be like, okay, they're talking about that aspect, to have the familiarity of stereotypes that aren't about Canada, but from Canada, the characters you know, the characters you recognize. And even though this took place long before I was born, it was just very familiar and lovely to watch. And the more I read Canadian books, the more I just feel at home in them. So I think that's a huge aspect of the book that I really enjoyed seeing Northern Ontario. The other aspect that I really enjoyed was seeing Elizabeth's story, who is Mrs. Orchard. She is a woman who was in her 30s and 40s in the 1940s, and she was infertile. And I am going to be going into some details, but neither me nor the book will go into graphic details. But she goes and has about 6 miscarriages, and she is very bereaved, and especially then when there was no resources and women were even more prized by who they were. And as a mother, not as a person, to have her relationship build with Liam, who is growing next door, and that friendship and relationship was just really emotional to see. And this is where I think the quietness really speaks to it. We don't ever have a lot of the dramatic things said, but we see it so evidently in her life. And I think that infertility is something that is so quiet. It's still a social taboo to talk about. It's still something that most women live in silence. And if you want someone who has talked very openly about it, Zoe's All Booked has a few videos talking about her several miscarriages and the trauma around that. And I think that it's just not an aspect of life that is ever talked about, and it is something that should be handled very quietly. I think not because it is an intense emotion, but because women and our bodies and our experience of infertility are so often not talked about. They're often so quiet and made to be aside. And like she's talking about seeing children, and she's just like, I can't do it. She's so worried that she's going to cry every time she sees it, and she's just trying not to cry. And that's the same thing. Like my own mother has said that about having a miscarriage and being around other children and trying to hold friends' kids and not cry is like something I've heard so much. So many of my friends who are my age and have not had children yet, but know that because of pre-existing conditions that we probably never will be able to have children. That is the case for me. I haven't attempted to have children yet, but I have a pre-existing condition that will most likely make me infertile. And it's hard for me to be around children. It's hard for me to see that because I love children so much and I want to be a mother and I hope to be a mother through adoption. But to know that that's something that is going to be very, very challenging is really difficult. So I related to this on such a personal aspect. And I know that so many other women too. And to have that in such a subdued manner mattered a lot to me. The other aspect that was very quiet that I really appreciated was Liam and his mental health. His mental health is never represented, and I think this is very important and evident for a man in the 1970s. I think mental health was definitely not represented now, and it's something that is still very hard, especially for men to deal with often because of toxic masculinity and the way that we approach therapy. But to have this where he is so evidently, he had a very rough childhood outside of his time spent with Mrs. Orchard, and he really struggles with that. And he is very unable to express himself. He is very unable to attach emotionally and fears it and avoids it without even really knowing that he's self-sabotaging himself from relationships. And that's something that's, as someone who has a counseling background, know that that's an evident point of view for people who have avoidant personality, and that he is very clearly struggling with mental health but unable to express it. And these are things where you don't need to have that on page to have that so very clearly represented. And I enjoy the fact that we see this through community. I think that therapy is very important, but as you know, he's living in Northern Ontario in the 1970s. There probably isn't a therapist for miles and miles. And to know that therapy is important, but also to have a sustainable support group is also really important. And that I think is what the basis of this novel really is about. It's about finding home and it's finding quietness and the need support, even without necessarily saying that. And I do really think that it's important to say your mental health. It's important to advocate for yourself and advocate for others. But sometimes the stories is true that you can't say that or you haven't found the words yet. And I think that that's why this is a really important story, even in its quietness, even in the fact that it might not look like what a lot of people would imagine a book about mental health would look like. And I think that that's really important. I have a fly. Please go away. I'm trying to film. A lot of my favorite stories of all time are very in-depth, blatant depictions of mental health. I think of The Bell Jar. I think of What I Lost. I think about The Astonishing Color of After. There are so many stories that I so love because it depicts the words that I can never say. But this depicts for me the words that I struggle to say. And the person with me is in a journey of sitting in the heart that we can't express. I have dealt with mental health since I was a child, and I've always been more on the avoidant side, even though I went into therapy and I, know how as a professional to help people through mental health. I've never completely learned how to express it myself. There's something that is very difficult if you grow up with the ability to avoid, to be able to learn to express yourself. And to be honest, I've been struggling with my mental health in the last year more than I have in the last, you know, years before that. This last year has been very, very hard, and the struggle to not completely avoid and completely withdraw from society is very difficult. And I can't express it. Even with all of my training, even with all of my support group and friends, I still struggle to sit in a room where I can help someone through crying and emotions for hours, and then I will go back and I can't express my own. And I think that that's really important to show. There's the depression and anxiety that looks like big, intense moments, that looks like breaking down, that looks like crying. But there's also the mental health that looks like numbing, that looks like apathy, that looks like fear, that looks like the inability to express your words, where I have sat across from someone and just been unable to say the words, to say what I am, to say the words that I'm depressed, to say the words of why I'm depressed, because I don't know. And I think that that is why this book is so powerful to me, even though it's so quiet, even though it might not be anything original. I think that it is original in accepting the fact that it's a book that's not blatantly ignoring mental health. It's a book that is accepting mental health and yet not completely being blatant about it. Because Mary Lawson is a psychologist. She understands mental health. She knows what she's doing with this book. And I haven't looked into it, but this is how I read this book. This is why this book is important to me. I think that I also really love the quiet small town. I like the fact that it reminds me of Alice Munro, who is also an Ontario writer from the same age group. I like the fact that it reminds me of home, that it reminds me of the words that I can't express. And even though this book might not be extraordinary to many people, I think that is a book that will stay with me for a very long time. And if you want a boring book that doesn't fully dive into anything but explains and sits with you in the moments, I think this book is a great example.